The first snow of November had arrived earlier than anyone expected. Chicago wore a thin white veil that softened the hard outlines of its skyscrapers and quieted the endless rhythm of traffic. Union Station was alive with travelers escaping approaching storms, returning home for holidays, or leaving familiar lives behind without knowing what would be waiting on the other side of the journey. Among hundreds of strangers moving beneath the enormous vaulted ceiling walked Ethan Carter. At 34, Ethan had become the kind of man people trusted immediately. Years of designing bridges and public buildings had taught him patience, precision, and the discipline of carrying responsibility without complaint. His appearance reflected that same quiet order. Dark wool coat. Black leather duffel. Every movement deliberate, every decision calculated long before it became visible. Few people could have guessed how empty his apartment felt every evening. 3 years had passed since his divorce, yet traces of another life still lingered inside him like echoes trapped inside an abandoned house. The marriage had not ended because of betrayal or hatred. It had simply dissolved beneath years of silence, endless work, and dreams that slowly drifted in opposite directions until neither of them recognized the person standing beside them. He had learned something dangerous after that. Loneliness eventually stopped hurting. It simply became normal. The assignment in Denver had lasted nearly 4 months. The project had finally reached completion, and for the first time in years Ethan allowed himself to take the train instead of another exhausting flight. 20 hours away from emails, conference calls, construction schedules, and impossible deadlines felt less like travel and more like permission to breathe. He stepped inside the sleeping car moments before departure. Warm light spilled across polished wooden walls while the low vibration of the locomotive hummed beneath the floor. Seat 12. Exactly where it should be. He placed his bag overhead, removed a hardcover novel he knew he probably would not finish, and settled into the quiet certainty that the night ahead belonged entirely to him. It lasted less than 2 minutes. Another passenger entered the compartment carrying a weathered canvas backpack and a medium-sized suitcase marked with faded airline stickers collected over many years. Claire Bennett stopped. Her eyes moved from the small digital number above the seat to Ethan, then back again. She looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. There was something inside her expression that suggested exhaustion could no longer be measured in hours of sleep. She removed her phone, opened her electronic ticket, and compared every number twice before taking another careful look around the compartment. Nothing had changed. The reservation was identical. Within minutes the conductor examined both tickets. The explanation arrived with an apologetic expression. A booking system failure had assigned the same accommodation to 2 passengers. Every remaining cabin on the train had already been occupied before departure. Outside, snow continued falling harder. Leaving the train was no longer an option. The conductor promised to search for a solution somewhere else on board before disappearing into the narrow corridor, carrying little confidence that one actually existed. The compartment fell silent. Not uncomfortable. Merely unfamiliar. 2 complete strangers occupying the same small space because of a mistake made by software neither of them would ever see. Ethan noticed details without intending to. Claire's coat had been repaired more than once instead of replaced. The camera resting inside her partially open backpack looked expensive but heavily used. A folded museum exhibition catalog rested beside it, its edges softened by constant handling. She noticed things as well. The worn corners of Ethan's notebook revealed years of use. His left hand carried the pale outline where a wedding ring had once rested. The expensive watch on his wrist showed scratches deep enough to suggest it had survived construction sites rather than office meetings. Neither of them acknowledged the observations. Outside, Chicago slowly disappeared beneath darkness. The train eased forward with gentle certainty. City lights stretched into long ribbons before dissolving into open fields blanketed by fresh snow. For the first hour they existed almost like reflections sharing the same mirror. Ethan attempted reading. Claire sorted photographs stored inside her camera. Neither succeeded in concentrating. Occasionally the movement of the train shifted luggage slightly or caused glasses to vibrate softly against polished tables. The mechanical rhythm gradually replaced the noise of ordinary life. As midnight approached, the conductor returned carrying disappointing news. No empty rooms. No cancelled reservations. No practical solution until Denver. The sleeping accommodations would have to be shared. Company policy allowed compensation afterward. Reality offered no alternative tonight. After another apology, the door closed once again. The silence that followed felt different. Not heavier. Simply permanent. Ethan adjusted his schedule without resentment. Years of unexpected construction failures had taught him that resisting reality wasted more energy than adapting to it. Claire reached the same conclusion through entirely different experiences. Life rarely asked permission before changing direction. The upper berth became his. The lower remained hers. The arrangement solved the practical problem while leaving everything else suspended somewhere between courtesy and distance. The lights dimmed. Beyond the windows, endless darkness covered Wisconsin farmland beneath drifting snow. Occasionally isolated farmhouses appeared like tiny islands floating inside an ocean of winter before disappearing again. Sleep refused to arrive. Ethan remained awake listening to the predictable rhythm of steel wheels crossing endless rails. Above deadlines and calculations, another thought slowly returned. The apartment waiting for him in Chicago would be exactly as he had left it. Clean. Organized. Silent. No one would notice whether he returned tonight or a week later. Across the compartment Claire lay awake for entirely different reasons. Denver represented a beginning that had never been part of her original plans. 6 months earlier she had imagined spending the coming winter planning a wedding instead of rebuilding a career hundreds of miles away. The engagement had ended quietly. No dramatic betrayal. No explosive confrontation. Only the gradual realization that two people could remain kind to each other while no longer belonging together. The realization had broken something inside her that optimism alone could not repair. She had accepted the museum position because remaining in Boston meant living inside memories carefully preserved on every street corner. Some cities refused to let heartbreak disappear. Perhaps another one would. Somewhere after Milwaukee the train slowed unexpectedly beneath heavy snowfall. The pause lasted nearly 40 minutes. Passengers remained inside while crews inspected frozen tracks ahead. The unexpected stop transformed movement into stillness. The world beyond the windows disappeared beneath thick curtains of white. Everything looked untouched. Temporary. Suspended. Inside the small compartment two strangers remained awake, separated by only a few feet and entire lifetimes of experience. Neither knew that the administrative error bringing them together would eventually become the smallest coincidence in a story neither of them had yet begun to imagine. The second crossing. Spring arrived in Denver with quiet confidence. The last patches of snow disappeared from shaded sidewalks, replaced by the bright green of fresh grass and flowering trees. The city seemed lighter than it had only a few weeks earlier. Cafes opened their terraces, cyclists reclaimed the streets, and weekend festivals returned to public parks. The long winter finally released its grip on Colorado. For Claire Bennett, the changing season marked something more personal. She had spent nearly 4 months building a life that no longer felt temporary. Her apartment had slowly filled with evidence of permanence. Books occupied every shelf. Framed photographs leaned against exposed brick walls. Small plants rested beside the windows, thriving in the generous Colorado sunlight. The unfamiliar city had begun replacing uncertainty with routine. She still carried the camera everywhere. Not because photography was her profession. Because it remained the only way she truly understood the world. She searched for unnoticed moments rather than spectacular events. Elderly couples sharing quiet walks through City Park. Street musicians performing for audiences too busy to stop. Children chasing pigeons across Union Station's wide plaza. Construction workers eating lunch together beneath unfinished buildings. Life revealed itself most honestly when no one realized they were being observed. The museum announced a new exhibition devoted to the changing architecture of the American West. The project required cooperation with several engineering firms that had participated in preserving historic structures across Colorado and neighboring states. Claire volunteered immediately. She expected weeks of cataloging blueprints, restoring archival photographs, and organizing historical documents. She did not expect the exhibition's lead consulting engineer. Ethan received the invitation 2 weeks later. His company had contributed structural research to the restoration of several 19th-century railway stations and bridges. The museum wanted technical guidance to accompany historical displays, allowing visitors to understand not only how the buildings looked but also why they had survived for generations. Normally he declined public appearances. Designing structures interested him. Talking about them rarely did. His supervisor insisted. The exhibition promised excellent publicity for the company. Reluctantly, Ethan agreed. The museum prepared its central gallery throughout early May. Massive photographs covered the walls. Original engineering drawings rested beneath protective glass. Scale models of historic railway bridges stood beside interactive displays explaining their construction. The exhibition explored more than architecture. It examined memory. Every building carried traces of the people who had imagined it, built it, repaired it, and refused to let it disappear. Claire spent hours adjusting lighting for individual photographs. One image demanded particular attention. A black-and-white picture captured a lonely railway station standing against endless prairie nearly 70 years earlier. The building no longer existed. Only the photograph remained. She studied it for several minutes. Places vanished. People vanished. Sometimes all that survived was proof they had once existed. The consulting team arrived the following Monday. Engineers, historians, preservation specialists, and museum staff gathered around a large conference table overlooking the sculpture garden. Claire entered carrying a folder of restoration notes. She focused entirely on arranging documents until movement near the doorway caught her attention. She looked up. Time hesitated. Not dramatically. Simply long enough for certainty to replace surprise. Ethan stood among the arriving consultants wearing the same calm expression she remembered from the train months earlier. He looked different beneath daylight. Less tired. More confident. Yet unmistakably the same man whose reflection still occupied a framed photograph inside her apartment. Recognition crossed his face almost immediately. No confusion. No hesitation. Only quiet acknowledgement. Neither moved. Neither smiled. Neither seemed shocked. The coincidence felt too improbable to produce ordinary reactions. It settled instead into silent acceptance, as though both had somehow expected life to repeat itself eventually. Other people continued entering the room unaware that two strangers had unexpectedly discovered each other for the second time. The meeting began. Introductions moved around the table. Only then did either of them finally learn the other's full name. Claire Bennett. Ethan Carter. Names transformed memory into reality. The anonymous passenger from cabin 12 became a real person with a history, a profession, and a place in the world. Throughout the morning the exhibition plans unfolded in careful detail. Claire described the visual narrative visitors would follow while moving through the galleries. Ethan explained how engineering choices had shaped both appearance and longevity. Their work complemented one another almost effortlessly. Where Claire saw emotion preserved inside photographs, Ethan recognized intention hidden beneath steel and stone. She interpreted stories. He explained foundations. Neither perspective felt complete without the other. Several museum employees noticed how naturally their ideas connected. No one knew they had already shared 20 hours aboard a delayed train months before. Over the following weeks, collaboration became routine. Not friendship. Not yet. Simply professional necessity. Claire spent mornings reviewing archival materials while Ethan visited construction sites throughout Denver before stopping at the museum each afternoon. They occupied the same workspaces for hours. Often without speaking. Silence had always belonged comfortably between them. The absence of conversation never suggested awkwardness. Instead, it allowed observation. Claire noticed that Ethan treated every maintenance worker, curator, and security guard with identical respect. Titles seemed meaningless to him. Competence mattered. Integrity mattered. Nothing else. Ethan observed Claire's extraordinary patience. She could spend an hour adjusting the position of a single photograph until natural light reached exactly the right angle. Most people chased efficiency. She pursued meaning. It fascinated him. One afternoon a violent thunderstorm swept across Denver. Visitors hurried from the museum while rain hammered against enormous glass walls. The city disappeared beneath curtains of water. Power flickered briefly before emergency systems restored the lights. Most employees left early. Claire remained inside the gallery protecting several fragile documents awaiting transportation. Ethan stayed as well, reviewing structural reports in a nearby office until the storm weakened. Outside, lightning illuminated the skyline. Rainwater flowed down museum windows in shimmering rivers. For nearly an hour they occupied different corners of the same nearly empty building. Neither realized the other had remained. When the rain finally softened, Claire gathered her belongings and walked toward the main entrance. There, beneath the enormous glass canopy, she paused. The streets remained flooded. Public transportation had temporarily stopped. She watched dozens of stranded visitors search unsuccessfully for taxis. Across the entrance hall Ethan emerged from another corridor. He stopped several yards away. Recognition arrived once again. Not surprising anymore. Almost familiar. For a brief moment they stood watching the storm together. No words passed between them. None seemed necessary. The rain eventually eased. People began leaving in every direction. The moment dissolved naturally into the evening. Yet both carried something home they had not possessed that morning. Curiosity. Not about the coincidence itself. About the person standing quietly on the opposite side of it. Some meetings ended after introductions. Others began only after the second encounter. Neither Ethan nor Claire understood it yet, but the journey that had started with one seat mistakenly assigned to two strangers was only now beginning to reshape their lives. Across the frozen plains. Morning arrived without sunrise. A blanket of heavy clouds covered the Midwest, allowing only a pale gray light to seep through the train's windows. The landscape beyond had transformed into an endless expanse of frozen fields, abandoned barns, and distant tree lines dusted with fresh snow. Every mile looked almost identical to the last, yet the constant movement made the scenery strangely hypnotic. The train was running nearly 3 hours behind schedule. No one aboard seemed surprised anymore. Delays became part of long-distance rail travel as naturally as the steady vibration beneath the wheels or the muted announcements drifting through the corridors. Ethan had slept only a few hours. Years of waking before dawn had trained his body to ignore opportunities for rest. He dressed quietly, careful not to disturb Claire, whose face carried an unfamiliar calm while she slept. Without the guarded expression she had worn the previous evening, she appeared younger, almost untouched by whatever burden had followed her onto the train. He stepped into the narrow hallway. Passengers wandered toward the dining car carrying coffee cups and newspapers. Elderly couples admired the snow-covered countryside while college students slept with headphones still resting around their necks. A retired soldier studied a paperback novel beside the window. A young mother entertained her restless son by pointing at passing freight trains. Everyone existed inside their own temporary world. For a day or two, strangers became neighbors. Then they disappeared forever. The dining car smelled of fresh coffee, toasted bread, and maple syrup. Ethan found an empty seat beside a window overlooking the Mississippi River as the train slowly crossed one of the country's longest railway bridges. The river below was beginning to freeze. Large sheets of ice drifted lazily across dark water while gulls circled overhead despite the bitter cold. He realized how rarely he had looked at anything without searching for flaws. Bridges usually interested him because of engineering. Buildings because of structure. Roads because of design. Today he simply watched. It felt unfamiliar. Almost uncomfortable. Several minutes later Claire entered the dining car. She carried the same camera from the night before, hanging loosely across her shoulder as though it had become an extension of her body over many years. She did not immediately notice Ethan. Instead, she stopped near one of the panoramic windows overlooking the river. Her attention settled on the landscape outside. Slowly she raised the camera. Without hesitation she captured the drifting ice, the steel framework of the bridge, and the faint reflection of passengers inside the glass. She photographed moments that most travelers ignored. Not dramatic scenes. Not spectacular landscapes. Only ordinary fragments of life that would disappear forever a second later. Ethan wondered what she saw through the lens that everyone else overlooked. Perhaps photography had never been about beautiful places. Perhaps it had always been about learning to notice them. By the time she found an empty table several rows away, breakfast service had already begun. Their paths never crossed. Neither seemed disappointed. The accidental companionship of the previous night had established an invisible understanding. They acknowledged each other's existence without feeling obligated to interrupt it. Hours slipped quietly into afternoon. Wisconsin surrendered to Minnesota. Minnesota slowly faded into endless stretches of open prairie. The scenery changed almost imperceptibly. Cities became towns. Towns became isolated farms. Eventually even the farms disappeared. Only snow remained. Claire spent most of the day moving between observation windows throughout the train. She photographed abandoned grain elevators, lonely churches standing against empty horizons, forgotten railway stations, and frozen lakes stretching toward invisible shorelines. Every image reflected solitude. Yet none of them appeared hopeless. There was beauty inside isolation. Not because loneliness itself was beautiful, but because empty places left room for memory. Ethan watched her occasionally without meaning to. She carried herself with quiet purpose. Unlike tourists searching for famous landmarks, Claire seemed drawn toward imperfections. Rust. Cracked paint. Weathered wood. Ordinary people waiting on lonely platforms. She looked for stories instead of scenery. He wondered whether she realized she moved through crowds exactly the same way. Always observing. Never asking to be observed. Later that afternoon the train stopped in St. Paul for refueling and crew changes. Passengers were allowed onto the platform for 20 minutes. Cold air struck like broken glass. The temperature had dropped well below freezing. Most travelers hurried only a few steps before retreating indoors again. Claire remained outside. Snowflakes drifted across the station while steam rose from beneath the locomotive in thick white clouds. She wandered slowly along the platform, photographing the enormous engine as mechanics inspected frozen equipment beneath its steel body. Ethan remained near the entrance, warming his hands inside his coat pockets. He noticed her pause near the far end of the platform where an elderly railroad employee stood alone watching snowfall collect upon empty tracks. The old man's face carried decades of experience carved into quiet lines. Claire never interrupted him. She simply lifted her camera once. The shutter clicked. The employee turned. Instead of annoyance, a gentle smile appeared across his face. He nodded almost imperceptibly before returning his attention toward the falling snow. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet something about it stayed with Ethan long after everyone boarded again. She had preserved a stranger's ordinary morning. Perhaps one day that photograph would become someone's memory. Perhaps memories needed witnesses before they could survive. Back aboard the train, evening settled over the plains far earlier than expected. Darkness returned. The compartment became familiar once again. Outside, occasional lights from distant farmhouses floated across the horizon like isolated stars. The heating system hummed steadily. Metal wheels continued their endless conversation with frozen rails. The silence between Ethan and Claire no longer felt accidental. It had become comfortable. They occupied the same space without demanding anything from it. Without explanation. Without expectation. Somewhere deep inside Nebraska, another announcement echoed through the train. A freight derailment farther west had forced every passenger train onto slower secondary tracks. Arrival in Denver would likely be delayed until morning. Nearly 6 additional hours. A quiet wave of frustration spread through the corridors. Travelers checked phones, canceled reservations, rearranged schedules, and searched unsuccessfully for stronger cellular signals across empty farmland. Ethan closed his laptop. Whatever meetings awaited him could survive another day. Claire looked through the compartment window. The reflection staring back at her appeared unfamiliar. It looked like someone standing exactly between two lives. Boston already belonged to the past. Denver still existed only as an uncertain future. The train was the only place where neither identity demanded anything from her. She realized she had not cried once during the journey. For weeks tears had arrived without warning. Now they refused to come. Perhaps grief had finally grown tired. Or perhaps movement itself carried a strange kind of healing. Outside, snow continued falling across the American heartland. Inside, two strangers drifted toward Denver with nothing connecting them except an administrative mistake, shared silence, and the strange feeling that this journey would remain with them long after they stepped onto separate platforms. Neither understood why. Neither tried to explain it. Sometimes the beginning of a story was too quiet to recognize while it was happening. Denver. The train rolled into Denver nearly 6 hours behind schedule. Morning had already settled over the city, though the sky remained hidden beneath layers of winter clouds. Snow rested on rooftops, traffic lights, and the long rows of parked cars surrounding Union Station. Travelers gathered their belongings with quiet urgency, eager to return to lives that had been placed on hold somewhere between Illinois and Colorado. For Ethan Carter, the journey had been little more than an interruption between two chapters of an already predictable existence. For Claire Bennett, it had been the bridge between the life she had abandoned and the one she had not yet learned to imagine. Neither expected to see the other again. As passengers filtered through the station, the temporary community created by the train dissolved within minutes. Families reunited beneath tall arched windows. Business travelers hurried toward waiting taxis. Backpackers unfolded maps and searched for bus terminals. Faces disappeared into the anonymous rhythm of a city beginning another ordinary day. Ethan stepped outside first. The cold mountain air felt sharper than Chicago's. The Rocky Mountains stood faintly against the western horizon, almost hidden behind drifting clouds. They seemed impossibly distant, yet large enough to remind every newcomer how small their own concerns truly were. A black SUV from the engineering firm waited at the curb. His phone vibrated almost immediately. Emails. Updated project schedules. Budget revisions. Requests for immediate approval. The silence of the train vanished in less than 30 seconds. By the time the driver merged into downtown traffic, Ethan had already returned to the world he knew best, a world measured by deadlines, calculations, and responsibility. Yet something remained strangely out of place. For the first time in years, the routine that had once protected him felt incomplete. He found himself watching the sidewalks instead of answering another message. The feeling disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Or so he believed. Claire remained inside the station long after most passengers had left. She stood beneath the enormous American flag hanging above the main hall and watched strangers disappear through revolving doors. Denver was beautiful in a way Boston had never been. The city felt younger. Wider. Less burdened by centuries of history. Its streets stretched confidently toward distant mountains instead of winding around memories. She breathed deeply. No familiar faces. No expectations. No reminders of the apartment she had left behind. Only possibility. A taxi carried her toward Capitol Hill, where the museum had rented a small furnished apartment for new employees. The building itself was modest, a century-old brick structure with narrow staircases, creaking wooden floors, and windows overlooking a quiet residential street lined with leafless trees. The apartment contained little more than the essentials. A bed. A small kitchen. A bookshelf. A worn leather sofa facing a single window. It did not feel like home. But it also carried none of the ghosts she had left behind. That alone felt like progress. The Denver Museum of Art welcomed her the following Monday. The museum occupied a striking modern building whose sharp angles contrasted dramatically with the older neighborhood surrounding it. Claire's responsibilities centered on preparing temporary exhibitions, cataloging new acquisitions, and restoring portions of the museum's growing photographic archive. The work demanded patience more than speed. It suited her perfectly. Photographs fascinated her because they refused to lie completely. Every image revealed both what the photographer intended and what they never realized they had captured. Human expressions. Forgotten details. Accidental truths. She often believed photographs understood people better than people understood themselves. The weeks passed quietly. Winter deepened across Colorado. Snowstorms arrived without warning before giving way to brilliant blue skies unlike anything she had known in New England. Slowly she built a routine. Morning coffee from the same corner cafe. A 15-minute walk to the museum. Evenings spent editing photographs taken throughout the city. Weekends exploring neighborhoods with her camera instead of a destination. Loneliness remained. But it became gentler. Almost manageable. Nearly 12 miles away, Ethan's life moved in the opposite direction. His company had secured another major infrastructure contract requiring months of additional supervision in Denver. Temporary assignments became permanent extensions. Hotel rooms turned into furnished corporate apartments. Every completed project was replaced immediately by another. Colleagues admired his reliability. Clients respected his precision. His supervisors quietly prepared him for another promotion. The success should have satisfied him. Instead, each accomplishment felt strangely lighter than the one before it. One Friday evening, after nearly 14 consecutive hours reviewing structural reports, he declined another dinner invitation from coworkers and walked alone through downtown Denver. Snow had begun falling again. Pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas while restaurants glowed warmly behind fogged windows. Music drifted from distant bars. Laughter echoed across narrow streets. Life unfolded all around him with effortless confidence. He remained outside it. Not excluded. Simply detached. His feet carried him without intention toward Union Station. The same station where he had stepped off the delayed train nearly 6 weeks earlier. Inside, travelers once again hurried between departures and arrivals. Different faces. Different destinations. The station itself remained unchanged. He bought a coffee and sat near one of the large windows overlooking the platforms. Another westbound train prepared for departure. Passengers embraced. Children waved enthusiastically. Porters loaded luggage into sleeping cars. Watching them, Ethan realized something unsettling. He remembered the woman from the train more clearly than many people he spoke with every day. Not because they had shared meaningful conversations. They had barely exchanged any words. Instead, he remembered details. The worn camera. The repaired coat. The quiet concentration with which she photographed ordinary moments. He could not explain why. Some people occupied only a few hours of life while leaving impressions that lasted unexpectedly long. Across the city, Claire experienced something remarkably similar. One evening she organized photographs from her journey west. Hundreds of images filled the screen. Frozen rivers. Railway bridges. Snow-covered stations. Endless plains disappearing beneath winter skies. Near the end of the collection she paused. One photograph had escaped her attention. The image reflected the compartment window during the first evening aboard the train. Outside, darkness concealed the landscape completely. Inside the glass appeared two faint reflections. Her own figure holding the camera. Behind her, barely visible, Ethan sat reading beneath a small overhead light. Neither face was entirely clear. The image looked almost accidental. Yet she could not delete it. It became the only photograph from the journey she printed. She placed it inside a simple wooden frame on the apartment bookshelf. Not as a memory of a stranger. As a reminder that lives sometimes crossed paths without needing explanation. Winter slowly surrendered to early spring. The city changed almost overnight. Snow melted into rushing streams flowing down gutters. Trees discovered tiny green buds. Restaurants filled outdoor patios despite lingering cold evenings. Months continued moving forward. Neither Ethan nor Claire searched for the other. Neither knew the other's last name. Neither expected fate to repeat itself. The train journey settled quietly into memory. A brief encounter. A curious coincidence. Nothing more. Or so they continued to believe. Because life often waited until people had completely accepted moving on before arranging the second meeting that would change everything. By the beginning of June, Denver had settled into the warmth of early summer. The mornings were cool enough to carry the scent of rain from the nearby mountains, while the afternoons filled the city with golden sunlight that lingered until late evening. Parks overflowed with families, cyclists crowded the trails along Cherry Creek, and every weekend seemed to offer another street market, concert, or outdoor exhibition. Life appeared effortless from the outside. For Ethan Carter, it remained carefully structured. His alarm sounded every morning at 5:30. Coffee. A 30-minute run through Washington Park. Construction reports before sunrise. Site inspections throughout the day. Evenings spent reviewing calculations that junior engineers had left unfinished. He had transformed routine into protection. Every scheduled hour left less room for memory. Less room for regret. The system had worked for years. Until recently. Now, without realizing it, he found himself adjusting meetings so they ended closer to the museum's closing hours. Sometimes he convinced himself he needed another look at the exhibition. Sometimes he claimed additional structural documentation was necessary. Occasionally those reasons were even true. More often they simply allowed him to walk through galleries where Claire was quietly working beneath soft lights. He never questioned the habit. Questioning it would have required admitting it existed. Claire noticed the pattern long before Ethan did. She recognized the rhythm of his visits. Late afternoons. Never rushed. Always carrying a notebook already filled with precise handwriting. He spent far more time studying historical photographs than engineering blueprints. It seemed unusual for someone whose career depended on mathematics rather than memory. She occasionally watched him from across the gallery. Visitors moved naturally through the exhibition. Children hurried toward interactive displays. Older couples paused beside photographs that reminded them of places they had once known. Ethan rarely joined the flow. Instead, he remained still. Almost invisible. Watching people instead of exhibits. As though architecture interested him less than the lives unfolding inside it. She realized they shared the same habit. Both observed the world from its edges. Neither had ever become comfortable standing at the center. The exhibition became unexpectedly successful. Local newspapers praised its combination of engineering and history. Attendance exceeded every projection. Museum administrators extended its run by another 6 weeks. The announcement delighted the staff. It also guaranteed Ethan and Claire would continue crossing paths almost daily. The coincidence had quietly evolved into routine. Yet their relationship remained difficult to define. They were not strangers. Not friends. Not colleagues in the traditional sense. They occupied a space somewhere between familiarity and distance. There was comfort in that uncertainty. Neither felt pressured to become someone else. Neither expected explanations. One Saturday morning Claire left Denver before sunrise. She drove west alone toward the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, following narrow highways that climbed steadily through forests of pine and aspen. The museum had granted employees a rare free weekend. Most spent it with friends or family. Claire chose solitude. She parked beside an abandoned mining settlement nearly forgotten by modern maps. Only fragments remained. Weathered wooden buildings leaned dangerously toward the earth. Broken windows reflected the surrounding mountains. Rusted railway tracks disappeared beneath wild grass. Nature had spent decades reclaiming everything people once believed permanent. Claire wandered slowly between empty structures. The silence felt different from city silence. It was older. Patient. Almost sacred. She photographed collapsed roofs, faded signs, and sunlight filtering through broken walls. Nothing hurried here. Even decay possessed dignity. Hours passed unnoticed. She reached the remains of a small railway platform overlooking a valley far below. The station itself had vanished long ago. Only cracked concrete foundations survived. Someone had left an old metal bench facing the mountains. Its paint had nearly disappeared beneath years of snow and wind. Claire sat there for several minutes. The view stretched endlessly westward. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt entirely alone without feeling lonely. The distinction surprised her. Perhaps healing did not arrive suddenly. Perhaps it accumulated quietly until one ordinary afternoon revealed its presence. She lifted her camera once more. The empty platform filled the frame. Beyond it, mountains disappeared into distant clouds. The photograph felt complete. She lowered the camera. A second figure entered her peripheral vision. Far across the abandoned station, another visitor examined the remains of an old signal tower. Tall. Dark jacket. Deliberate movements. Recognition arrived almost instantly. Ethan. He had not seen her. Not yet. The coincidence seemed almost impossible. Denver contained millions of possible destinations. The Rocky Mountains stretched across hundreds of miles. Yet somehow they had chosen the same forgotten place on the same morning. Neither had planned it. Neither could have. Claire remained seated. She watched him walk slowly through the abandoned station, occasionally stopping to study weathered beams or rusted steel connections supporting what little remained of the original structures. Even here he looked at buildings before landscapes. His profession had become the language through which he understood the world. A gust of mountain wind carried loose gravel across the platform. Ethan turned instinctively. Their eyes met across nearly 50 yards of open ground. Neither appeared startled anymore. Surprise had accompanied the second meeting. This third encounter produced something quieter. Acceptance. As though chance had begun insisting upon its own importance. He raised one hand in silent acknowledgement. She responded with a slight nod. The distance between them remained exactly where it was. No one crossed it. No conversation interrupted the stillness. The mountains seemed to prefer silence. After several minutes Ethan continued toward another section of the abandoned settlement. Claire remained on the bench watching sunlight drift across distant peaks. They explored the ghost town separately for almost 2 hours. Occasionally one caught sight of the other moving between old buildings. Two parallel paths. Never intersecting. Yet never entirely apart. Late that afternoon Ethan left first. His truck disappeared along the winding mountain road until only dust remained. Claire stayed behind. She returned to the empty platform one final time before driving back to Denver. There, resting on the weathered bench, she noticed something she was certain had not been there earlier. A small sketchbook. Its dark blue cover had been softened by years of use. Inside were page after page of hand-drawn bridge designs, architectural details, and observations from construction sites across the country. No name appeared anywhere. Only one folded sheet of paper rested between the final pages. It contained a carefully drawn pencil sketch of the abandoned railway station exactly as it might have looked a century earlier. She immediately understood. The sketchbook belonged to Ethan. He had left without realizing it. Claire closed the cover gently. For the first time since boarding the train months earlier, fate had placed something real into her hands. Something that required another meeting. Not by coincidence. By choice. The final day of the exhibition arrived beneath an impossibly clear July sky. By the time the museum opened its doors, a line of visitors already stretched across the entrance plaza. Families, students, retired engineers, photographers, and tourists moved patiently toward the galleries, each hoping to experience the exhibition before it disappeared forever. Temporary things often attracted the greatest attention. People rarely hurried toward what they believed would always remain. Claire walked through the galleries before the first visitors entered. The walls looked exactly as they had for weeks, yet everything felt different. By sunset, every photograph would begin its journey back into climate-controlled storage. Every model would be dismantled. The exhibition had occupied months of her life. Tomorrow it would exist only in memory. She paused before one final image, a panoramic photograph of an abandoned railway bridge stretching across a forgotten canyon in Utah. It had become her favorite. Not because of its composition. Because of its silence. The bridge carried no trains anymore. Its purpose had ended decades earlier. Yet it remained standing, refusing to collapse simply because no one needed it. She often wondered whether people survived in much the same way. Ethan arrived earlier than usual. His responsibilities that day were surprisingly light. Most structural inspections had already been completed. The museum staff no longer needed technical guidance. By every practical measure, his work there had ended. He could have stayed at his office. No one expected him to return. Yet something drew him back one last time. He spent hours wandering through the exhibition almost as any ordinary visitor would. For the first time since becoming involved in the project, he stopped analyzing support systems, lighting angles, and architectural details. Instead, he looked at the photographs. Really looked at them. He noticed emotions hidden inside landscapes. He saw loneliness inside abandoned buildings. Hope inside restored stations. Time preserved within rusted steel. Claire had been seeing those things from the beginning. Only now did he finally understand. The museum closed at 6 o'clock. Employees locked the entrance doors while the final visitors slowly disappeared into the warm Denver evening. An unusual quiet settled across the building. No footsteps. No conversations. Only distant ventilation systems humming softly through empty corridors. Work began almost immediately. Protective gloves appeared. Wooden crates lined the galleries. Curators documented every object before removal. The exhibition disappeared piece by piece. Claire helped lower framed photographs from the walls. Each empty space revealed a slightly brighter rectangle where sunlight had never reached the paint beneath. It looked almost like a memory refusing to fade. Across the gallery, Ethan supervised the safe dismantling of several large architectural models. When the final display case stood empty, he stepped back. The room suddenly felt much larger. Almost unfamiliar. As though months of shared routine had evaporated within a single evening. By 9 o'clock the gallery stood completely bare. Fresh white walls reflected soft overhead lights. Nothing remained except echoes. Employees gathered briefly in the museum cafe before leaving one by one. Laughter filled the room. Photographs commemorated the successful exhibition. Plans for future projects were discussed enthusiastically. Claire smiled when appropriate. So did Ethan. Yet both understood something the others did not. Tomorrow there would be no reason for their paths to cross. The exhibition had been the only thread connecting their separate lives. Once it disappeared, coincidence would have to work much harder. Night settled over downtown Denver. Most museum lights switched off, leaving only the exterior illuminated against the dark sky. Claire exited through the staff entrance carrying a single cardboard box filled with personal belongings from her office. A framed photograph. Several books. Camera batteries. A small potted cactus that had somehow survived months of neglect. She walked slowly toward the parking lot. Halfway there she stopped. The plaza overlooking the sculpture garden stretched quietly beneath the stars. A warm breeze carried the scent of summer flowers. For reasons she could not explain, she remained standing. Not waiting. Simply unwilling to leave just yet. Several minutes later the museum doors opened again. Ethan emerged carrying nothing except the worn sketchbook tucked beneath one arm. He locked the door behind him, handed his temporary identification badge to a security supervisor, and started walking across the same plaza. He noticed Claire almost immediately. She stood near one of the large steel sculptures reflecting the city lights. For a long moment neither moved. There were no visitors left. No colleagues. No unfinished work. Nothing remained except two people whose lives had crossed repeatedly through circumstances neither had planned. This time there would be no delayed train. No museum project. No forgotten sketchbook. No abandoned railway station. Only a decision. Ethan slowly reached into the sketchbook. From between its pages he removed the photograph Claire had placed there weeks earlier. The abandoned platform. The distant mountains. His own figure standing almost unnoticed beside the ruined signal tower. He looked at the image for several seconds before carefully placing it inside the cardboard box she carried. A simple gesture. Almost symbolic. The memory no longer belonged only to him. Claire rested one hand lightly upon the photograph. She understood. Some moments deserved to be carried forward rather than left behind. The city around them continued living its ordinary Friday night. Cars flowed through intersections. Music drifted from nearby restaurants. Laughter echoed across crowded sidewalks. Yet the museum plaza remained strangely untouched by the noise. They began walking toward the parking area. Not together. Not separately. Their pace naturally matched. The distance between them measured only a few feet now. Far smaller than the hundreds of miles that had first brought them onto the same train. Far smaller than the emotional distance both had carried for years. The future remained uncertain. They still knew remarkably little about one another. Their pasts remained largely unexplored. The wounds that had shaped both lives had not disappeared simply because fate continued arranging unexpected meetings. Real closeness would demand something coincidence never could. Choice. For the first time since Cabin 12, that choice waited quietly ahead of them. And neither turned away. The following Monday felt strangely unfamiliar. For nearly 3 months, Ethan had arranged his schedule around the museum without admitting it to himself. Every inspection, every meeting, every site visit had been planned with quiet precision so that, by late afternoon, he would somehow find a reason to walk through those galleries. Now the exhibition was gone. The museum no longer required him. His calendar returned to what it had always been. Construction sites. Engineering meetings. Conference rooms with glass walls overlooking half-finished buildings. Emails arriving faster than he could answer them. Nothing had changed. Yet the days suddenly felt longer. Claire experienced the same emptiness from the opposite side. The gallery where the exhibition had lived was being transformed for an international collection of contemporary sculptures. Workers repainted walls. Electricians installed new lighting systems. Wooden crates arrived carrying unfamiliar artwork. The museum moved forward without hesitation. It always had. She respected that rhythm. Museums existed to preserve history, not to live inside it. Still, she occasionally found herself standing outside the now empty gallery, remembering how naturally Ethan had occupied its quiet corners. Not because she expected him to return. Because routine had become memory faster than she thought possible. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the exhibition closed, Claire walked through a neighborhood farmer's market a few blocks from her apartment. Summer had transformed Denver. Local musicians played beneath strings of warm lights. Children chased one another between food stalls. Artists displayed handmade pottery, paintings, and jewelry beneath white tents. The city felt alive in a way winter had never allowed. She carried her camera but had taken very few photographs. For once, observing seemed enough. Near the far end of the market stood an elderly man selling restored pocket watches from a small wooden display. Each watch had been repaired by hand. Each carried tiny imperfections left intentionally visible. The old craftsman believed restoration should never erase history. Claire admired the philosophy. She purchased nothing. Instead, she lingered beside the display, studying decades of careful work preserved inside polished metal. A familiar figure appeared several stalls away. Ethan. He examined a collection of handmade wooden furniture with the same quiet concentration he applied to architectural drawings. He had not noticed her. For the first time since the train journey, fate had offered Claire a choice. She could simply continue walking. Perhaps their story would end there. A series of remarkable coincidences eventually fading into pleasant memory. Or she could alter its direction. She remained still for only a few seconds. Then she walked toward him. Not because coincidence demanded it. Because she wanted to. Ethan looked up just as Claire approached. Recognition softened the surprise almost immediately. There was no awkwardness. Only the calm familiarity that had developed through months of silent companionship. They stood beneath rows of hanging lights while evening settled gently over the market. Around them, strangers continued browsing, laughing, and carrying bags filled with fresh fruit and flowers. Life flowed naturally around two people who had spent months avoiding decisions by allowing chance to make them instead. Neither reached for certainty. Neither hurried. Instead, they began walking through the market together. The movement felt effortless. Almost inevitable. Claire stopped occasionally to photograph details that caught her attention. An elderly couple sharing homemade pie. A child asleep inside a stroller while colorful balloons drifted overhead. A violinist performing beneath an old maple tree as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and violet. Ethan found himself watching her more than the market itself. Not because she demanded attention. Because she noticed beauty before anyone else realized it existed. He wondered what the world might look like through her eyes. They eventually reached the western edge of the market where the crowds thinned. A small pedestrian bridge crossed Cherry Creek below. Water reflected the fading light in slow, shimmering patterns. People paused there briefly before continuing home. Claire remained longer. She leaned lightly against the railing, watching the current carry fallen leaves downstream despite the middle of summer. Nature always seemed to move forward. Even when people struggled to do the same. Ethan stood several feet away. The bridge beneath them reminded him of dozens he had designed throughout his career. Every successful bridge solved the same problem. It connected two places separated by distance. Its purpose was never to become the destination. Only the path. The thought lingered unexpectedly. Perhaps people built emotional bridges in much the same way. Slowly. Carefully. Trust added piece by piece until crossing no longer felt dangerous. Darkness settled completely before either noticed the time. The market vendors began packing their remaining goods. Street musicians finished final performances. Families drifted toward parking lots carrying sleepy children. The evening quietly approached its end. Claire realized she had spent nearly 3 hours beside Ethan without feeling the need to protect herself from silence. Months earlier silence had represented distance. Now it felt like understanding. Not every connection required constant explanation. Some simply existed. As they left the bridge, their paths reached the point where they naturally separated. Claire's apartment lay east. Ethan's truck waited several blocks west. For a brief moment both paused. Parting felt unexpectedly significant. Not because they doubted meeting again. Because neither wished to return to depending on coincidence. The future suddenly seemed filled with possibilities that required intention instead of luck. Claire removed a small card from her camera bag. On it appeared nothing more than her name, her museum email address, and a personal phone number written neatly beneath. She held it for a moment before placing it gently into Ethan's hand. No dramatic gesture. No expectation. Only trust offered in its simplest form. Ethan looked at the card without immediately putting it away. For someone who had spent years believing loneliness was easier than disappointment, the tiny piece of paper felt unexpectedly heavy. Not because of what it contained. Because of what it represented. A door left open. A future no longer dependent on fate. When they finally walked away in opposite directions, neither looked back. Neither needed to. For the first time since a reservation system mistakenly assigned one seat to two strangers, the next chapter of their story belonged entirely to them. And choice, unlike coincidence, had only just begun. Claire held the sketchbook carefully during the drive back to Denver, resting it on the passenger seat as though it were something fragile enough to be damaged by sudden movement. The late afternoon sun painted the mountains in deep shades of amber and bronze. Long shadows stretched across the highway while distant peaks slowly disappeared beneath gathering clouds. She considered opening the sketchbook again. She did not. Some belongings carried a quiet intimacy that deserved restraint. Although the notebook had been left behind by accident, it still belonged to someone else. She preferred knowing only enough to return it. Nothing more. Ethan realized it was missing nearly 40 miles later. He had stopped at a roadside gas station west of Golden to refill the truck before continuing toward Denver. While reaching for his notebook to review measurements taken at the abandoned station, his hand met only the empty passenger seat. For several seconds he searched automatically. The center console. The floor. His backpack. The rear seat. The result remained the same. The sketchbook was gone. It had accompanied him for almost 12 years. Every bridge he had inspected, every city he had lived in, every unfinished idea had found its place within those worn pages. It was never intended for anyone else's eyes. Not because it contained secrets. Because it contained honesty. He remembered the abandoned station. The old bench. The quiet afternoon. Claire. The conclusion arrived without effort. She would find it. Whether she opened it remained entirely her choice. Oddly, the thought did not disturb him as much as it should have. Monday morning returned with its familiar rhythm. Museum employees prepared for another busy week as visitors slowly filled the galleries. Sunlight filtered through enormous windows, illuminating suspended dust that drifted almost invisibly through the warm air. Claire arrived carrying the sketchbook inside a canvas bag. She spent the first hour cataloging newly donated photographs before noticing Ethan entering through the staff entrance precisely as he had every Monday since the exhibition began. He looked exactly as usual. Dark blue shirt. Rolled sleeves. Notebook absent from beneath his arm. Only then did she notice the faint tension hidden beneath his otherwise calm expression. He knew. Their eyes met briefly across the gallery. Neither approached immediately. Professional responsibilities came first. Visitors asked questions. Curators adjusted displays. Engineers reviewed installation supports. Nearly an hour passed before the museum gradually emptied during the quiet period between guided tours. Claire walked toward one of the reading rooms overlooking the sculpture garden. The canvas bag rested lightly against her shoulder. A few moments later Ethan entered the same room carrying several architectural drawings. The space remained empty except for them. Large windows overlooked flowering trees swaying gently beneath the June breeze. She placed the sketchbook carefully on the wooden table. then stepped back. No explanation. No expectation. Simply the quiet return of something that had been misplaced. Ethan looked at it for several seconds before reaching forward. His fingers rested lightly upon the worn cover. Relief appeared almost imperceptibly across his face. He opened the notebook. Every page remained exactly where he had left it. Nothing seemed disturbed. When he reached the final drawing of the abandoned station, he paused. Tucked carefully beside it rested a single photograph. Claire had printed it over the weekend. The image showed the empty railway platform beneath the afternoon sun. The old bench stood at its center. Far in the background, almost unnoticed, a solitary figure examined the remains of the signal tower. Ethan. He had never realized she had photographed that moment. The composition transformed an ordinary afternoon into something strangely timeless. The man appeared impossibly small against the vast landscape, yet perfectly placed within it. He studied the photograph for a long time. It revealed exactly what Claire always searched for. Not people. Not places. The relationship between them. The image carried no signature. None was necessary. He carefully slipped the photograph between the pages beside his own pencil sketch. Two different ways of preserving the same memory. Something changed after that morning. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. The distance separating them simply became smaller. Still no unnecessary conversation. Still no forced familiarity. Yet their movements around the museum gradually synchronized without either noticing. If Ethan examined structural drawings inside the archive room, Claire often appeared there cataloging photographs. If Claire spent an afternoon documenting restoration work, Ethan somehow arrived to inspect supporting beams. Coincidence became habit. Habit became comfort. Other employees noticed. One curator jokingly referred to them as the exhibition's permanent fixtures. Neither objected. The exhibition's final month approached quickly. Closing dates appeared on promotional posters throughout the museum. Visitors increased once again, determined to experience the collection before it disappeared. Temporary exhibitions always ended. That knowledge gave every remaining day additional weight. Claire found herself lingering longer inside the galleries after closing hours. She watched empty rooms settle into silence. Soon the photographs would return to storage. The models would be dismantled. Walls would be painted white once more. Evidence of months of work would vanish within days. The thought saddened her more than expected. Perhaps because endings had become too familiar. Late one evening, after the museum closed, she wandered alone through the nearly empty exhibition. The building felt entirely different without visitors. Only emergency lights illuminated the galleries. The photographs seemed quieter. More personal. She paused before the large black and white image of the forgotten prairie station. The same photograph she had studied weeks earlier. Behind her, footsteps echoed softly across polished floors. She recognized the rhythm before turning. Ethan had remained after another inspection. He stopped several feet away, his attention fixed on the same image. Neither looked toward the other. Their eyes remained on the photograph. The station no longer existed. The people who had built it were long gone. Yet somehow their work continued to bring strangers together decades later. The realization settled gently between them. Some structures survived because they were built well. Others survived because someone remembered them. Outside, evening sunlight faded behind the mountains. Inside the museum, the exhibition stood quietly waiting for another day. Neither Ethan nor Claire realized that the closing of the exhibition would soon force them to decide whether their connection belonged only to those gallery walls, or whether it could exist beyond coincidence, beyond routine, and beyond the place where fate had continued bringing them together. For the first time, chance alone would no longer be enough. Summer settled comfortably over Colorado. The mountains no longer wore traces of snow except on their highest peaks, where white ribbons still clung to the rugged landscape. Denver stretched beneath endless blue skies, and the city seemed determined to spend every possible hour outdoors. Parks remained crowded until sunset. Cafes filled their sidewalks with tables and flowers. Every weekend invited people to leave their homes and remember that life could be lived slowly. For Ethan Carter, routine had changed in a way so gradual that he failed to notice it. For years, every Saturday had belonged to work. Construction schedules never paused for weekends. Engineers were expected to solve problems before Monday mornings, and Ethan had accepted that expectation without complaint. His calendar had always been full. Now, empty spaces had begun to appear. Not because there was less work. Because he had stopped allowing work to occupy every available hour. The change surprised even him. The business card Claire had given him remained inside his wallet for 3 days before he finally decided to use it. The hesitation had nothing to do with uncertainty. It came from unfamiliarity. He had spent years avoiding the possibility of disappointment by refusing to begin anything that might eventually end. Hope had become risk. Yet something about Claire made caution feel heavier than courage. He wrote a short email. Nothing elaborate. Only a suggestion to visit the Denver Botanic Gardens during the weekend, where a temporary outdoor photography exhibition had recently opened. He expected to wait hours for a reply. Instead, an answer arrived less than 20 minutes later. Simple. Warm. Without unnecessary words. The exhibition sounded interesting. Saturday morning would be perfect. The gardens welcomed them beneath clear skies and the gentle warmth of late July. Sunlight filtered through towering cottonwood trees while narrow pathways wound between ponds covered with floating water lilies. Sculptures emerged unexpectedly among flowers, blending naturally into carefully designed landscapes. Visitors moved quietly, almost instinctively lowering their voices as though entering a place where silence deserved respect. Claire carried her camera. Ethan carried nothing. For once, he had left his notebook inside the truck. The decision felt symbolic. He wanted to experience the day rather than document it. The photography exhibition featured large outdoor prints suspended between trees. Most celebrated dramatic landscapes from around the American West. Towering mountains. Violent storms. Endless deserts glowing beneath sunrise. Claire admired them. Yet Ethan noticed her lingering longest before the smallest images. A lonely mailbox standing beside an empty road. A forgotten baseball field overgrown with weeds. Rain collecting on an abandoned porch. Ordinary places transformed by attention. He understood why. Those photographs resembled the ones she created herself. She searched for quiet stories hidden inside ordinary lives. As the afternoon unfolded, they wandered without destination. Neither hurried toward the next exhibit. Neither checked the time. Occasionally Claire paused to photograph details overlooked by nearly everyone else. A butterfly resting briefly on a white rose. The reflection of clouds inside a shallow pond. An elderly gardener patiently removing dead leaves from a flower bed before anyone else noticed they had fallen. Ethan found himself observing not the subjects she photographed but the way she approached them. She never interrupted moments. She waited for them. Patience, he realized, had become her greatest artistic talent. Later they followed a shaded path leading toward a quiet section of the gardens where fewer visitors ventured. A wooden bench overlooked a small lake surrounded by tall grasses swaying gently in the breeze. The city disappeared behind dense trees. For several minutes they remained there, watching dragonflies skim across the surface of the water. The stillness reminded Ethan of the abandoned railway station high in the Rockies. Different place. Same feeling. There were people whose presence demanded conversation. Claire was different. With her, silence never felt empty. It felt complete. During the following weeks, Saturdays quietly became theirs. Not by agreement. Simply through repetition. Sometimes they drove into the foothills before sunrise, watching the first light touch distant mountain peaks. Sometimes they visited small Colorado towns where old brick buildings preserved stories forgotten by larger cities. On other weekends they remained in Denver, exploring bookstores, public gardens, art festivals, and neighborhood cafes. Every outing revealed another small piece of each other's lives. Ethan discovered that Claire rarely photographed people looking directly at the camera. She believed honesty disappeared the moment someone realized they were being observed. Claire learned that Ethan never crossed a bridge without slowing his pace. He instinctively examined the lines, supports, and hidden joints that held thousands of tons safely above rivers and valleys. Structures fascinated him because failure was rarely visible until it became unavoidable. People, she sometimes thought, worked exactly the same way. August arrived with afternoon thunderstorms rolling down from the mountains. One evening heavy rain forced them to seek shelter beneath the broad canopy of an old train platform near Denver's historic rail yards. Freight trains passed slowly through the darkness, their headlights cutting long beams across wet steel tracks. Claire watched the rain collect between the rails. Ethan studied the aging platform roof above them. The station had long ago surrendered its importance to newer terminals. Yet it remained standing. Not because anyone depended on it. Because someone had decided preserving it mattered. He wondered whether relationships required the same choice. Not convenience. Commitment. Their lives gradually began overlapping beyond weekends. Claire attended a public lecture where Ethan spoke about restoring historic bridges throughout the American West. She stood unnoticed near the back of the auditorium. Listening to him outside the museum felt different. He spoke with quiet confidence, never seeking admiration. Instead of discussing engineering as mathematics, he described bridges as promises. Promises that people would always find a way across rivers, valleys, and impossible distances. The audience applauded politely when the lecture ended. Claire remained seated for several moments afterward. The idea stayed with her. A promise. Perhaps that explained why abandoned bridges always saddened Ethan more than abandoned buildings. A bridge fulfilled its purpose only when someone chose to cross it. A week later Ethan visited a small gallery displaying Claire's newest photographs. She had never mentioned the exhibition. He discovered it accidentally through the museum's newsletter. The collection contained only 24 images. None were spectacular. A barber sweeping hair from an empty shop after closing. A waitress arranging chairs before sunrise. A mechanic washing grease from his hands beneath a rusted faucet. Life between important moments. He walked slowly from one photograph to the next. By the time he reached the final frame, he realized something unexpected. Claire's photographs never documented loneliness. They documented resilience. Every subject continued moving forward despite quiet hardship. Hope existed in every image. It simply refused to announce itself. As summer slowly approached its end, Denver prepared for another autumn. Neither Ethan nor Claire had spoken of the future. Neither had defined whatever existed between them. Labels seemed unnecessary. Some connections grew stronger without demanding immediate names. Yet beneath the comfort they had found together, life continued moving. Careers advanced. New opportunities approached. The choices both had postponed for months were quietly gathering on the horizon. Neither could see them yet. But change, like the distant rumble of a mountain storm, had already begun its slow approach. December arrived quietly. The city was decorated with white lights long before the first major snowfall. Store windows reflected wreaths and garlands. Holiday music drifted through shopping districts, and Union Station filled once again with travelers carrying wrapped gifts and heavy suitcases. The same station where two strangers had once shared a mistake now welcomed thousands of people beginning journeys of their own. Neither Ethan nor Claire visited it anymore. Perhaps both understood that some memories were too fragile to disturb. Ethan postponed the conversation for nearly 2 weeks. Every evening he convinced himself that tomorrow would be easier. Tomorrow would provide the right moment. Tomorrow would somehow remove the disappointment from Claire's eyes before it ever appeared. Tomorrow never came. Instead, the silence grew heavier. He had spent his entire career solving complicated engineering problems through careful planning. Human emotions refused to follow blueprints. Claire sensed the truth long before hearing it. Small changes always revealed themselves first. Ethan answered work calls more frequently. His desk at the apartment filled with folders carrying the names of cities in Washington state. New bridge designs replaced Colorado maps. His calendar became crowded again. The rhythm she had once helped soften slowly disappeared. She recognized the pattern. People preparing to leave always became busier before their departure. Not intentionally. Only because their attention had already begun traveling ahead of them. The conversation finally happened on a cold Sunday afternoon. Snow covered the walking trails surrounding Sloan's Lake. The water had begun freezing along its edges while hundreds of geese gathered before migrating farther south. The city looked suspended between seasons. Neither autumn nor winter. Neither arrival nor departure. Much like them. No raised voices disturbed the quiet shoreline. No accusations shattered the calm. Only honesty. The promotion. Seattle. January. 3 years. Perhaps longer. Claire listened without interruption. She had imagined many possibilities. None felt easier once confirmed. When Ethan finished, silence returned naturally. He had expected anger. Instead, he found sadness. Sadness proved far more difficult to carry. 3 days later, Claire received her own email. The subject line alone changed everything. She had been selected. One of 6 photographers. The fellowship would begin in February. New York. 12 months. Possibly more if the program expanded into international work. Her hands remained motionless above the keyboard long after reading the message. She should have celebrated. Instead, she looked through the apartment window toward the snow-covered street below. For months she had believed life had finally stopped asking impossible questions. She had been wrong. When she told Ethan 2 evenings later, neither appeared surprised. Perhaps both had already understood where their separate ambitions were leading. Seattle. New York. Opposite coasts. Different futures. Different dreams. Neither opportunity represented an escape. Each represented years of work finally being recognized. Asking the other to refuse such a chance felt impossible. Supporting it felt equally painful. Christmas approached. Denver glowed beneath thousands of lights while snow continued falling almost every week. They spent time together whenever work allowed. Nothing dramatic changed. They still visited bookstores. Still wandered through quiet neighborhoods. Still watched sunsets disappear behind the mountains. Yet every shared moment quietly transformed into a farewell before either admitted it aloud. The ordinary became precious. Morning coffee. A familiar street. The sound of footsteps beside one another. People rarely understood the value of routine until routine prepared to disappear. On the evening before Ethan's departure, they drove one final time into the mountains. Not toward any famous destination. Only along the same roads they had explored throughout the summer. Fresh snow covered the forests. The world looked untouched. They stopped beside the abandoned railway station where Ethan had once forgotten his sketchbook. Winter had reclaimed the place completely. The old platform stood beneath deep snow. The weathered bench remained where it always had. No footprints disturbed the white surface. Claire took one last photograph. Not of the station. Not of the mountains. Of the empty bench. It seemed enough. Ethan walked slowly toward the remains of the signal tower. Months earlier he had stood there unknowingly becoming part of Claire's photograph. Now he understood why she had chosen that moment. Some places preserved more than history. They preserved change. They left before sunset. The drive back to Denver passed almost entirely in silence. Neither tried to fill it. There were no perfect words waiting to be discovered. Some truths became smaller when spoken aloud. January arrived beneath heavy snow. Union Station bustled with travelers escaping delayed flights caused by winter storms. Ethan stood once again beneath the same enormous vaulted ceiling where everything had begun almost a year earlier. His luggage rested beside him. The sketchbook remained inside his backpack. Between its pages lay the photograph Claire had taken at the abandoned station. He had carried it every day since receiving it. Across the city, Claire prepared for work without looking at the clock. She knew exactly where Ethan would be. She chose not to go. Goodbyes had already happened long before this morning. Some departures became easier when left unseen. The train pulled slowly away from the platform. Denver disappeared behind falling snow. The mountains faded into distant white clouds. Ethan watched until the skyline vanished completely. For the first time in years, movement did not feel like freedom. It felt like loss. February carried Claire eastward. New York welcomed her with crowded sidewalks, towering buildings, and relentless motion. Everything moved faster. People walked faster. Worked faster. Dreamed faster. Her photographs began appearing in respected galleries. Critics praised her ability to reveal quiet emotion inside ordinary American life. Success arrived exactly as she had once imagined. It simply arrived beside an absence she had never expected. Months became years. Seattle transformed Ethan into one of the country's most respected bridge restoration engineers. New York transformed Claire into an internationally recognized documentary photographer. Awards accumulated. Projects expanded. Their names appeared in magazines neither would have believed possible only a few years earlier. From the outside, both lives looked complete. Only they understood what remained unfinished. Sometimes achievement filled a resume more easily than it filled a heart. Neither married. Neither searched very hard for someone else. Life continued moving. But part of it remained standing beside an abandoned railway station high in the Colorado mountains, waiting for a journey that had never truly ended. 5 years passed. The United States changed in countless small ways. New buildings rose above familiar skylines. Old neighborhoods welcomed new families. Highways expanded. Museums opened new wings. Rail stations were restored while others quietly disappeared into history. Time continued doing what it had always done. Moving forward without asking whether anyone felt ready. For Ethan Carter, Seattle had become both a triumph and a refuge. The bridge restoration program he had once feared accepting had transformed his career beyond every expectation. Projects that had once seemed impossible now carried his signature. Historic suspension bridges reopened under his supervision. Professional organizations invited him to lecture across the country. Young engineers spoke his name with admiration. He appreciated every accomplishment. Yet every hotel room still felt temporary. Every apartment remained sparsely furnished. Every success ended the same way. By returning to silence. His sketchbook had grown thicker over the years. Among hundreds of new drawings, one photograph never changed its place. An abandoned railway platform beneath the Colorado sun. Claire Bennett had become one of the country's most celebrated documentary photographers. Her exhibitions traveled from New York to Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, and Washington. Critics described her work as quietly devastating. She never photographed extraordinary people. She photographed ordinary lives with extraordinary honesty. A retired school janitor locking empty classrooms for the final time. A fisherman repairing old nets before dawn. A waitress closing a family diner after 40 years. Her photographs reminded people that history belonged to everyone. Awards followed. Interviews. Books. International invitations. None of them erased the small wooden frame that still stood on a bookshelf in her apartment. Inside remained the accidental reflection captured during the train journey years earlier. Two strangers sharing a compartment. Neither realizing they had already become part of each other's future. In early September, Claire received an invitation from the Denver Museum of Art. The museum planned a major retrospective celebrating photographers whose work had documented the changing American landscape over the previous decade. The director personally requested her participation. Returning to Denver had never been part of her plans. She accepted anyway. Autumn welcomed her exactly as she remembered. The air carried the same dry mountain freshness. Aspen trees shimmered in brilliant shades of gold. The skyline had grown taller, but the mountains remained unchanged. Some things deserved permanence. Walking through the museum felt strangely familiar. Different exhibitions occupied the galleries. Different employees crossed the hallways. Yet certain corners remained untouched by time. The reading room overlooking the sculpture garden. The quiet corridor leading toward the archive. The entrance where rain had once delayed their departure. Memories waited patiently inside every space. The retrospective opened on a Friday evening. Hundreds of guests filled the museum. Collectors. Artists. Journalists. Students. Friends from every stage of Claire's career. Her photographs occupied the largest gallery. Images collected over years of travel covered the walls. Small towns. Forgotten highways. Factories. Ranches. Storms. Celebrations. Loss. Hope. America, exactly as she had learned to see it. Near the center of the exhibition stood one photograph unlike the others. The abandoned railway platform in the Colorado mountains. Visitors admired its composition without understanding why the artist had chosen such an ordinary place. Only Claire understood. Some landscapes remembered people long after people stopped remembering themselves. Several states away, Ethan received an unexpected email. One of his former colleagues from Denver attached an article announcing Claire's exhibition. The message contained only a single sentence. "Thought you might like to know." He stared at the screen for several minutes. 5 years. He had imagined countless versions of meeting Claire again. None had ever seemed real enough to happen. By evening he had booked the earliest flight to Denver. The museum remained crowded throughout the weekend. Claire spent hours speaking with visitors, signing books, and answering questions about her work. Late Sunday afternoon, the flow of guests finally slowed. The gallery settled into a quieter rhythm. She walked alone toward the photograph of the abandoned station. It always drew her back. Standing before it, she noticed another figure several feet away. Tall. Dark coat. Hands resting quietly inside familiar pockets. Time had left gentle marks across Ethan's face. A few silver strands appeared near his temples. His posture remained unchanged. Steady. Patient. He looked at the photograph for a long time before turning. Recognition arrived without surprise. As though 5 years had merely extended one long conversation rather than ended it. Neither hurried toward the other. Some distances deserved to disappear slowly. The museum around them continued breathing. Visitors wandered through neighboring galleries. Soft footsteps echoed across polished floors. Afternoon sunlight entered through high windows, illuminating tiny particles of dust floating almost invisibly through the air. Nothing dramatic happened. Life rarely offered dramatic reunions outside novels. Instead, it offered ordinary moments carrying extraordinary meaning. Claire noticed the familiar sketchbook beneath Ethan's arm. He noticed the old camera hanging from her shoulder. Some things remained loyal despite passing years. He carefully opened the sketchbook. The photograph of the abandoned platform still rested between its pages. Its edges had softened from being carried across thousands of miles. Without hesitation, he placed it beside the framed print hanging on the gallery wall. The small original photograph and the large exhibition print showed the same place. The same afternoon. The same memory. Only time separated them. Visitors walking past never understood why both artists stood quietly before that single image. They saw only a photograph. Ethan and Claire saw the beginning of everything. The exhibition closed several hours later. Museum staff switched off gallery lights one section at a time. Outside, Denver glowed beneath the warm colors of an autumn sunset. 5 years earlier they had walked away from the museum believing life demanded separate paths. Perhaps it had. Perhaps neither would have become the person standing there today without first leaving. Careers had flourished. Dreams had been fulfilled. The people who had once relied on coincidence had finally learned something greater. Love was not built by chance meetings. Chance only opened the first door. Everything that followed depended upon the courage to keep walking. They stepped outside together. The evening air carried the scent of falling leaves. Somewhere beyond the city, trains continued crossing the plains toward distant destinations. Passengers still boarded with strangers. Reservation systems still made mistakes. Lives still changed for reasons no one could predict. This time, however, there was no train waiting. No coincidence arranging another encounter. Only two people choosing, freely and without fear, to walk in the same direction. For the first time, home no longer meant Chicago. Or Boston. Or Seattle. Or New York. Home had never been a city. It had always been the quiet certainty of finding someone who made every journey feel worth taking. Autumn arrived slowly. The first hints of gold appeared high in the aspens covering the Rocky Mountains before the color spread downward through Colorado. Morning air became cooler. Evenings ended earlier. Denver exchanged the easy rhythm of summer for a quieter season filled with long shadows and crisp light. For Ethan and Claire, life continued with a comforting predictability. Weekends still belonged to shared journeys. Sometimes they drove north toward small mountain towns where 19th-century storefronts remained untouched by modern architecture. Sometimes they followed forgotten highways through valleys where abandoned grain silos and rusted rail crossings reminded Claire of the photographs she loved to create. Neither spoke often. Neither needed to. They had learned one another's habits without realizing it. Claire always paused before taking the first photograph of the day, waiting until the landscape felt complete. Ethan instinctively slowed whenever they crossed a bridge, regardless of its size. Each had become familiar with the other's quiet rituals. It felt less like falling in love and more like gradually recognizing a place that had somehow always existed. By early October, Ethan received a call from the company's headquarters in Chicago. The proposal represented everything he had spent years working toward. A multinational engineering consortium had selected his firm to oversee the restoration and expansion of several aging transportation corridors throughout the Pacific Northwest. The largest project centered around Seattle. 3 years. Perhaps longer. The promotion included a substantial salary increase, complete creative authority, and the opportunity to become one of the youngest regional directors in company history. It was the kind of offer engineers waited entire careers to receive. The board expected an answer within 2 weeks. His colleagues congratulated him before he had even accepted. Everyone assumed the decision would be immediate. Only Ethan hesitated. Across the city, another opportunity quietly appeared. The Museum of Modern Art in New York announced a year-long fellowship for emerging documentary photographers. Only 6 artists would be selected nationwide. The program offered international exhibitions, financial support, and access to archives unavailable anywhere else in the country. Claire's museum director encouraged her to apply. Her portfolio had grown remarkably during the previous year. Several of her photographs from Colorado had already attracted attention from national publications. The fellowship could redefine her entire career. Applications closed in 10 days. She had dreamed of opportunities like this long before moving to Denver. Yet when she downloaded the application forms, she found herself unable to begin. Neither mentioned the opportunities. Not immediately. Perhaps because speaking them aloud would transform possibilities into reality. Instead, they continued living as though nothing had changed. Autumn leaves drifted across city sidewalks. Coffee shops filled with people escaping colder mornings. The mountains glowed brilliant shades of orange beneath clear skies. Outwardly, everything remained exactly the same. Internally, invisible fault lines had begun spreading beneath the surface. One Saturday they drove west along Trail Ridge Road, one of the highest paved highways in North America. Snow had already returned to the highest elevations. The peaks stood dazzling beneath the afternoon sun while valleys below remained covered in brilliant autumn forests. They stopped at an overlook where the entire landscape unfolded for miles in every direction. Claire raised her camera. Then lowered it again. For once, she preferred remembering the view rather than photographing it. Some moments resisted preservation. They deserved simply to be lived. Ethan watched distant clouds gathering beyond the mountains. He had always admired landscapes because they obeyed physical laws. Weather arrived. Seasons changed. Nothing remained permanent. People, however, complicated everything. The strongest structures he had ever designed still relied upon flexibility. A bridge that refused to move eventually cracked under pressure. He wondered whether lives followed the same principle. The following week, Ethan finally accepted the promotion. Not because ambition outweighed everything else. Because refusing it felt dishonest. Engineering remained the work that gave meaning to his life. He had spent years earning this opportunity. Ignoring it would not erase the desire. The transfer would begin in January. 3 months. He promised himself there would still be time. Time to explain. Time to understand what happened next. 3 days later, Claire submitted her fellowship application. She pressed the final button just before midnight. The confirmation email arrived instantly. Selection results would be announced in early December. She closed the laptop without relief. She had expected excitement. Instead, uncertainty settled quietly inside her. She realized something uncomfortable. For the first time in years, her career no longer stood alone when she imagined the future. Another person had become part of that picture. Whether either of them acknowledged it or not. Late October brought the first heavy snowfall of the season. Denver awoke beneath several inches of fresh white snow. Traffic slowed. Schools opened late. The city looked remarkably similar to the morning Ethan and Claire had first arrived months earlier aboard the delayed train. The coincidence did not escape either of them. They spent that evening walking through City Park as snow continued falling around empty pathways. The lake reflected little beyond scattered lights from the distant skyline. Claire remembered the first night aboard the train. Two strangers sharing silence because circumstances offered no alternative. Now the silence felt entirely different. It carried questions. Not discomfort. Expectation. Neither had spoken about Seattle. Neither had mentioned New York. Yet both sensed change approaching with unavoidable certainty. Winter had returned. And with it came decisions that coincidence could no longer postpone. Some journeys began because of chance. The next stage of theirs would depend on whether love could survive when life demanded two different directions.